Michael Popok, Legal AF. Donald Trump was a lot closer to using the U.S. military to stay in office after he lost the election than we ever knew. This based on new reporting from Jonathan Karl in his book about Donald Trump called Tired of Winning. Now, there was a reference in the Jan 6 committee report about Donald Trump being so irate at statements coming out by the Defense Department, his Secretary of State Defense, his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, that said in no uncertain terms that the military would have no role in the peaceful transfer of power, that is done in a civilian way under the 20th Amendment, especially to move the power from the outgoing president to the incoming president and for him to be the commander-in-chief. And so we had reporting at the time in May and in September, October, November, leading up to the election and beyond, in which those statements were made time and time again. But we now know from the new reporting that Donald Trump was irate that two leading members of the military, one, the Army Chief of Staff, James McConnell, and the Army Secretary, Mr. McCarthy, Secretary McCarthy, had gone on the record as saying that there would be no role for the military in the peaceful transfer of power or to defend or to determine the outcome of the election. Donald Trump was so upset about that because it was inconsistent with the meetings he was having with people like Mike Flynn and Sidney Powell at the time, the Overstock.com founder, and others, and Mike Lindell, that had told him that he should use things like the Insurrection Act or martial law to suspend the Constitution, to seize voting machines, and to stay in power beyond the election, beyond Inauguration Day, beyond the certification of the election. And so we had heard these statements being made, which we thought at the time were extraordinary. Never in the modern history am I aware, or is any presidential historian aware, of the military having to take an affirmative stance and make a statement in order to appease or to comfort the American people that the U.S. military would not be used against them to decide the outcome of an election. So at the time, there's so much going on with Donald Trump that is outside the boundaries, outliers, beyond the pale, beyond the norm, that we just kind of chalked it up to another, well, that's kind of weird, slightly comforting, weirdly comforting, that the military would have to feel the need, as if we're in some sort of a dictatorship, to say that they would not, and they're under civilian control in America, of course. The secretaries of state, the secretaries of defense, the secretaries of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, Coast Guard, Space Force, they're all civilians. They may have one time served in the military, but they're civilians. We have civilian-controlled military here. And the commander-in-chief's powers under the 20th Amendment end on the day the new president is sworn in. And we have a couple of really good statutes on the books and laws on the books that would stop, you would hope, a president from trying to use the U.S. military against its own people. But that's what Donald Trump was considering. This is who the Republicans are going to make as their nominee. I just want to make this clear, in case I'm not connecting the dots quick enough on this hot take. The person that the Republicans are going to nominate to be president strongly considered using the military against his own people in a craven attempt to cling to power. Jonathan Karl reports the following, that Johnny McEntee, if Trump gets back in, remember the name Johnny McEntee. Johnny McEntee had a very powerful position in the White House. He was the head of personnel for Donald Trump, meaning he's the guy that gets everybody the jobs in civil service and every other position, and vets all of them and recommends them to Donald Trump. He's going to have a huge position if Donald Trump gets back in power. He's already part of the shadow government, and he sits in a think tank along with all the rest of them, Jeffrey Clark and the rest that are just waiting to get back into power. He was sent on a mission by Donald Trump to go to the acting Secretary of Defense, right? The acting Secretary of Defense, and tell him to tell those two, right? The Army Chief of Staff and the Army Secretary not to make any more statements indicating that the military would not be used to have Donald Trump stay in power, because that pissed off Donald Trump as he was having these secret meetings, considering using invoking martial law, invoking the Insurrection Act of all things. Talk about poetic injustice. He would have used the Insurrection Act in order to suspend certain types of laws and use the military against his own people, even though there's another law on the books in the United States, been on the books for hundreds of years, called the Posse Comitatus Act, which stops any president from using the army or the military to enforce internal laws, domestic laws of the United States. So yes, there is a series of laws this would have violated, but Donald Trump sent McEntee to go meet with the acting Secretary of Defense with the message, and get this, to tell them to knock it off and don't make any more statements like that or they're going to be fired. McEntee went back and reported the news in a note to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, and this is in the Jan 6 committee report, ripped up the note. That is a presidential record that needs to be preserved for the National Archive. He ripped up the note, as he ripped up notes his entire business career, but now, of course, he's president with other obligations. Those notes were located, reconstructed, taped together, given to the Jan 6 committee, who used it in their investigation and turned it over to the National Archive. Good work, Donald Trump. You didn't rip it up into enough pieces or burn it or whatever, you incinerate it, whatever you wanted to do. So we know the note exists because it was reconstructed and taped back together again and is now sitting in the National Archive. This is... I mean, I've said so many times on Hot Takes that this event, whatever I'm going to talk about, should be disqualifying for Trump. But the fact that he was even considering using the U.S. military against his own people in order to stay in office, if that doesn't send a chill down your spine, if there's any hope that you may change your mind about your vote, think about that one. If you take one thing with you, if you only take one thing with you into the voting booth, make it that one. The fact that he would even consider that, right? Against the Posse Comitatus Act, against the Insurrection Act, use martial law, suspend the Constitution, tell his military to gag his military. Speaking of gag orders and Donald Trump, imposing a gag order on his military not to take to the airwaves to console and give comfort to the American people that they wouldn't be at the wrong end, right? The business end of a rifle of U.S. military in order for Donald Trump to stay in power. Don't tell the American people that. Why? Because it was inconsistent with what he was trying to do, the coup plotting that he was doing in the White House in December and in January to stay in office and to do all of these terrible things. Thank God Jonathan Karl was able to pull all that together in his new book, and we're getting, and I'm reporting it here as I learn it, as I read it, right here on the MeidasTouch Network. Out of control, megalomaniacal dictator with his finger literally on the nuclear button, willing to use the American military and all of its force and lethal force against American people in order to stay in power. I can't even believe my mouth has to form those words on this hot take, but it does, because we don't blow smoke or sunshine here on the MeidasTouch Network. I do hot takes like this about every day. Sometimes it seems like every hour, at the intersection of law, politics, and justice. And then we pull it all together with the best stories or the ones we think you should know about in a curated podcast we call Legal AF. It is exactly what you think. Wednesdays, I do it with Karen Friedman Agnifilo. Saturdays with Ben Meiselas. And then if you like this particular hot take, give me a thumbs up. It helps with the ratings. Free subscribe to the MeidasTouch Network. Help them get to 2 million free subscribers. It is important. It is a grassroots media company without outside investors. And the bigger it gets, the more your voice is heard. Until my next hot take then. Until my next Legal AF, this is Michael Popok reporting.
Hey Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.